Hello, I'm Dr. Timothy Lewis, talking about the book, The Poetics of Matthew 1. And this time I'm talking about what's in chapter 4 of the book. And it's, well, it was the most difficult chapter to write because it's dealing with not all the assumptions, but a whole bunch of popular assumptions that we tend to read into the story, into Matthew chapter 1, particularly verses 18 to 25, just focusing on what are the assumptions that we usually use in order to try to make sense of the text. So when I say we, I mean interpreters throughout history, people who write commentaries, sermons, books. Um, Usually there's a set of assumptions, at least one or two or three or four, that we feel like it's necessary to have in order to make the text make sense. We've got to have, the text needs a little bit more something in order to make it make sense. And so on the one hand, yes, we are expected to read between the lines and make some assumptions. But when we look a little bit closer at, well, what about the assumptions that we've been using, the popular assumptions, are they actually getting us into what we're expected to get out of the text? So, yeah, it was a very difficult chapter to write. It's called Looking for Things Not There. And there are 5 assumptions that I analyze, and there's three questions that I put to each of these assumptions. Is it mentioned in the text? Is it compatible with the text? And what reason might we want to hold this assumption? And the third one's really important because people are less likely to critique the assumption if they don't know why they're holding it, or why they we've really got to think about what is it that is holding us to the assumption that we're holding. So these are the 5 assumptions. The 5 most popular assumptions concern conception, scandalous rumors, forbidden premarital sex, potential execution, and assumed adultery. So they're quite popular assumptions. And so I thought they were the most relevant ones to look at because they are the ones that are driving our interpretation, even though those things aren't necessarily in the text. Well, they're not in the text in the way that these assumptions are assuming. Yeah, so conception is one that we assume is mentioned in the text because it's mentioned in Luke. So we end up reading Matthew as if we're reading Luke. And so in Luke, Mary is talking to an angel, and the angel is talking to her about how she will conceive. She will conceive. How she will conceive is the topic that they are talking about. And that's not something that we find in Matthew. So it's best not to read it in because it means that we're missing what the story is in Matthew. I'm not saying that people shouldn't read Luke, that's fine. But I'm studying Matthew in this case. So does that assumption help us with Matthew? Well, I find that actually it interferes with the story that we're expected to get out of Matthew. The next one is, that first one's quite long. The next one is scandalous rumors. So there are 2 kinds of, the 2 kinds, because the next one after that is forbidden premarital sex, which also is very similar to another kind of scandal. So there's two kinds of scandal that I talk about that are quite popularly read into the story, as if that's the framework for the story. But that's not. It's not mentioned in the text. It's not compatible with the text. In fact, it's quite incompatible with the text. And why do we want to hold these assumptions? It's usually because of assisting us. We think that it's assisting us with our own situations that we've got in modern times, and we're reading it more like a modern story. Yeah, as I said, this was a very difficult chapter to write. I didn't really want to write this chapter. I thought I could just move on to all the things that are in the text, but I kept thinking, no, I really probably should. I really should talk about what's not in the text, so that if we're not, otherwise, if we're not letting go of these assumptions, we're not able to really see what is there. Yeah, so there's quite a long chapter. Got some diagrams. Here's the diagram on whether people know in the story. Oh, I don't know if you can probably see. I don't know that you can probably see that diagram, but anyway, it's just the diagrams are very simple. Who knows in the story that Mary is already pregnant in verse 18? So you can think of it as a concentric sort of. Well, the story's audience knows. Mary presumably knows, and presumably other household members in Mary's who are living in the same house as Mary. And then as you get further out and further out, Joseph is the next person to know that Mary is pregnant. But then you get to public, and that's an unknown. It doesn't seem like that's known in the story. And that seems to be a very important thing to notice in the story, is that no, Joseph is making a decision in order to say or to not say to the public, like in order to make it public or not to make it public. Like that's part of the fabric of the story, is what's Joseph going to do publicly. Well, he's not going to do anything that's talking about Mary's pregnancy publicly. So the public-private aspect is really important to distinguish between. So I think this is a really important one here. Joseph wrongly assumed Mary was guilty of adultery. That's a difficult one to talk about. But when we look at, is it mentioned in the text? No. Is it compatible with the text? We usually just assume, well, of course it's compatible. That's what we need. We need to read that in to make the text make sense. There's one aspect of it that does seem to be quite compatible, but the other aspects to that assumption are not. And anyway, so the final one, I think that is the final one. That's the fifth one. The one before that, the fourth assumption was Joseph should have handed Mary over to be executed. So the expectation of execution, that's not part of what's going on with Joseph. Joseph is immediately said to be a righteous man, which is supposed to tell us something about how Joseph is thinking, and it's moving us away from thinking about there's going to be any violence or anything. That's anyway. I've gone into much more detail in the book about what the text is actually saying. And that there's no expectation of Joseph handing Mary over to be executed. That's not what's going on at all. In fact, if you look at later on in Matthew, when Jesus is talking about divorce in the cases of adultery, and that people are using divorce to basically commit to adultery. Men are dismissing their wives in order to get remarried, and Jesus is saying, well, that's basically adultery. So the assumption in that case is that, well, in the cases of adultery or suspected adultery, people get divorced. That assumption runs through, which is a completely different assumption than the assumption that Joseph is expected to not get divorced, but hand Mary over to be executed. So I think some of these assumptions, they're so strong, so prevalent, so powerful, they're driving the interpretation of the text, and we all just keep assuming, well, that's the way to read it, and we're not really critically examining these assumptions like we should be. And yeah, so that's the chapter 4 of the Poetics of Matthew 1.